Hello, I'm Catherine Polly, and we're at the Old Church Gallery today. We'd like to welcome the Floyd County community and the Citizens Network into our museum. We're I guess what you might call a creative cultural arts museum, and we concentrate on things that were made in Floyd County. Anywhere from a small walnut or nut that was carved to beautiful mountain coverlets and quilts. What we're looking at today is basically give you an idea of who we are and what we do, and we want to concentrate on the Feedsack show. When I was in college, a lot of people who were away from here, girls would tell me, when they read about the Appalachian Mountains and Feedsacks, they thought we wore burlap. And they were very surprised when they saw the beautiful, magnificent patterns that the Feedsack culture offered to the people through the mountain area. Now, I wanted to point out a couple of my favorite pieces, some of the things that you can visit when you come to the gallery, to the Old Church Gallery. And one of my favorite pieces is Aster. Aster is a rhinoceros that was created up at Buffalo Mountain by Mr. Andy Hilton, and it's made from a piece of burl wood. I'm not sure what kind. It has chestnut pieces on it. It also has, I feel like these legs were made from table legs, so it's an assemblage, but it's a really wonderful, humorous, delightful piece from a man who made his living with the hard work of his hands farming, much like R.O. Slusher, who was also a hard-working farmer and an excellent folk artist without knowing it. He never knew. But one of my favorite things he does is the dancing dolls, which a lot of you, I'm sure, have enjoyed seeing up at the country store, that play. When he retired, he wanted to do a doll. And a doll has always been something that is a part of our national cultural view, but it was a single doll. And R.O.'s wife, Evelyn, challenged him, and she said, well, R.O., people dance as couples. Can't you make them dance as couples? Well, being the farmer engineer that he was, he got out a box of Tinker toys and rubber bands and old wood, and he started thinking about what he did. And oxen and horses worked with a single tree between them to help them work as a team. So he created a single tree from Tinker toys and fishing lures so that his couple would move as a team when they dance. And of course, this attaches to the person playing the musical instrument, to their thumb, to the floor, to a doorknob. And as the person played, they would dance to the rhythm. Of course, I neither play nor dance, so I'm not giving a very rhythmic performance. Then those two gentlemen, by the way, weren't they first cousins, I believe. And then one of my next favorite pieces, I like it all, though. I can't really say that. One of my next favorite pieces is this wonderful, funky little table that was made by Marvin Thomas. And what Marvin did was to take pieces of broken down furniture, pieces that were no longer worth anything, and he would marry them to each other. It's called a marriage. And he would put them together, and so that they formed a whole. Like this bottom piece is actually from an old candle stand. And then I recognize these as being pieces off of an old cabinet or a chest of drawers. The checker pieces look like they were cut from a broom handle, which is just wonderful. And we have several folk art pieces by Marvin, and we're very pleased to have them. But all of not just the folk arts, but the other arts that were created here, the music and everything, is a way that people tell their stories. We view ourselves as storytellers, whether it's through an oral history, whether it's through a basket, whether it's through Aster or a funky little table or dancing dolls. What we're doing is to tell the story of the creative culture of Floyd County and the mountains even beyond us. We are very much like other areas around us. There are little things that set us apart as being this place and this time, but there are also things that connect us with other small places in their place and in their time. Now, if we move into the special exhibit for this season, which is concentrating on the Feedsacks, mountain people took materials that were available and created all sorts of things out of them. The women especially, in finding these wonderful patterns, they used them in quilts, they used them in aprons, they used them in pillowcases, they used them in shirts and clothes and dresses, just a variety of things. One of my favorite things I learned in doing this exhibit was from a quilt top from Alice Slusher's family that she brought in, that during World War II, the Feedsacks, they actually did a commemorative group of Feedsack patterns. Like these two have the airplanes on them. There's a couple down here with the stars with the blue background. So and here's another one with the airplanes. I was very excited to learn something new. Some of the other pieces that are included in the gallery, a piece that we just received from Mike and Nan Johnson is a wonderful rocker that was made and woven by Mr. Tice, who was a minister and a longtime resident and a contributor to the community at large. Okay, shall we travel along? This grandfather clock was also made by Mr. Andy Hilton and donated by his daughter Brenda, who also donated Astor. I think this is probably a pretty good indication of the kind of craftsman that Mr. Hilton was and what he was capable of, and yet the very humorous piece that Astor offers to us. If we come on around in this room, music, of course, is an important part of our storytelling and who we are as a people and the creative abilities of the people. We come on over to a wonderful painting of the town around the turn of the century by Francis Harmon. And you'll notice that it does have Buffalo Mountain in the background. And we're getting ready to do a Buffalo Mountain exhibit, or an exhibit based on different artist interpretations of the buffalo and the heart part that it impresses on them. So we all think that's going to be a lot of fun, and how it's used throughout our community here, because it is the sort of the iconic symbol of the county and has been for generations. All the way to, we have several quilts that are in storage and mountain coverlets, which are just one of the most precious things, I think, to come out of the culture here from the woolen mills and from people raising sheep and gathering the wool and working the wool up and dyeing it and then weaving it into these wonderful patterns. This is almost like a pop art piece from the 1960s. It makes my eyeballs go crazy, but it's an absolutely wonderful piece. And then all the way, this is a really wonderful piece too. Mr. Lawrence Wood had this, and the it's called a sugar cabinet. But what is so absolutely beautiful, other than the wonderful patina in the wood, is the blacksmithing that was done on the hinges. They're just absolutely beautiful. Beautiful. I like seeing the handiwork of people, and especially of people who worked hard, whose hands were not only their creative production, but it was also their hands were the work of their living, the way they made the living, the way they got through each day. Okay. And if we move back in this, and of course butter, one of my favorite things, the butter prints. Look at this. Talk about fancy butter.
Wow.
I mean, you didn't just get a pound of butter or 2 pound. You got it with this wonderful design on the top of it. Ladies were just very, very proud of their butter and what they produced in their kitchen. And these wonderful print patterns are just another one of, I just have all kinds of favorite things in here. Well, we're going to see Feedsacks right now if you all want to come on along. And now we have come into the room with the wonderful, wonderful colors. It's almost like entering a color wheel when you come in here. It's just a feast for the eyes. Everywhere you look, colors and shapes and textures just pop, and it's such a wonderful, wonderful room to be in. I wanted to say that all of these wonderful things that are made were made thanks to women who knew how to nag their husbands in a way to get what they wanted. These feed sacks, as they're called, came in grain at the mill. It took 1 feed sack to make a child's dress. It took 3 feed sacks to make an adult woman's dress. Now, the women needed to have the same pattern, so they would take a little clipping and give it to their husbands to go to the mill and get them the same pattern from each visit. And I know Mr. Gene Vaughn told us that it really worked on their backs to have to be throwing those big, heavy sacks around just to find a particular pattern. But when I was a little girl, we would go to my grandmother's home in the summers, and she had a big trunk upstairs. And she would sit beside of the trunk and open it up, and we would all be sitting in a semicircle in the front of her, the little girls. And then our mothers were sitting in chairs behind us in a semicircle. And Granny would bring out on her lap a wonderful folded, washed and ironed feed sack. And we got to pick a pattern for a dress. And of course, as soon as we finished, we were ready to run outside and play whatever children play. And our mothers then were left to pick out their feed sacks for their dresses. And it's one of my favorite memories of my grandmother, because she had saved these feed sacks all winter long for her children and her grandchildren. One more thing, and that is something I mentioned a while ago. Another one of my favorite things is this absolutely wonderful quilt that was designed and made by Miss Lucille Nolan. And these are the most sweetest designed little butterflies, speaking as an artist, that I think I've seen in a quilt. There's a real innocence to the pattern and a beauty in that innocence that is just difficult to mimic. It has to come from the heart. And also, I'd like to point out, we have a little boy's shirt up there, but Frank Hancock was kind enough to tell us the story and to bring his picture of when he was a child going to school. They had made him a shirt out of some of the feed sacks, but it had dancing dolls on it, and he hated it. But what happened, what was so funny, he ended up wearing it 2 years in a row to have his picture made. So his memory of feed sacks as a little fella is not as pleasant as those of us as little girls who had the frilly dresses with bows and ties on them. As I started to say, Janet will sort of take over now and give you an idea of some of the history of the development of these wonderful things. And I'm going to slide over here out of the way.
As Catherine told you, I'm Janet Slusher Keith, actually another first cousin to Andy and Roe, whom she introduced in the front room. My memories are very personal ones because my mom and dad, being farmers, and my growing up on a farm, I know very well that there was very little money for things other than the necessities. I know that Dad, in buying perhaps sacks of seeds in very coarse bags, which had writing on them, but that was okay if Mother took the seams out and used this kind of material to make ticks, which is what the mattresses were called in her time, that were stuffed often with corn shucks, straw, possibly feathers if they were fortunate enough to have enough feathers to make a feather bed. But my mother always said that to have a tick filled with straw, fresh straw, was the best sleeping you could ever have. That was one of her stories. Now, as you can see, this feed sack has been bleached so that the print is basically non-existent. And the families would have made their own lye soap, and from many washings, you would eventually have materials. Even though still coarse and not really something that you would be making a garment from, farm families are going to find a practical use for everything. So when we look at another couple of these bags, and the farm women, like my mother, making use of whatever it was that was available, when something like this sack appeared, of course this material is much finer than the coarse material that seeds perhaps would have come in. But who wants to wear a garment that has a fat cow or sheep or hog on it? So there were smart men who, in realizing that women had started to use their materials after having bleached them out for making items for the home, whether it was curtains or towels, bed linens, that if they then began to provide their chicken feed, their hog feed, in sacks made of beautifully printed designs, they were selling much more feed that way. Now this was enriched feed, and for farm families who were, in many instances, subsistence families, making their living, providing for their own needs, why would you be buying extra feed for your chickens or your hogs if they can get plenty of grass or from the corn and oats that you're raising? But think about it. Very often the trading they would do at the local stores would be to take their eggs, to take their butter, to take their hams. So if they are using enriched feed and buying that enriched feed in these beautiful feed sacks, then it makes sense that they're going to have more eggs, better milk, or more milk, and it's a cost-effective kind of thing to be buying the feed. Now you can see, I think, if we zoom in, you can see the original stitching that has been taken out and turned under to make a pillowcase. And my mother had 6 pairs of pillowcases set aside for me when I got married, and my children would pick for those pillowcases because after numerous washings they were so soft to the skin. They were the perfect kind of thing to even make babies' diapers from. So I also have certainly memories of going to the store, not necessarily the mill, but our local store, who also provided chicken feed and hog feed, and going along with Daddy. And for me, from the ages of, say, 6 to 10, it took 2 feed sacks. So I would get to go to the stack and choose which sacks would make my next dresses. Now, Mother had a sewing machine very much like this one, and she made most of the dresses that my sister and I wore when we were growing up. In fact, the very first things I ever sewed for myself were made from feed sacks using a treadle sewing machine just like this one. Now, this last item that I'm going to share is not a feed sack, but a flour sack. And flour sacks and sugar sacks were much finer material, but I think this is, as Catherine would say, a favorite, because look what they've done. They've provided for the little children to have a doll made from their sack.
Okay, you can turn it. Okay.
My name is Clara Martin, and I'm here to talk about some of the quilts in this wonderful show. I'll base it on my family experience, but it's typical of many farm families in Floyd County. I'll start with my grandmother. I don't know if you can zoom in here. My grandmother married in 1894 when she was 16 years old. Over the next 30 years, she would have 13 children. 3 died in infancy. She raised 10 to adulthood in a big old 2-story log house, very drafty. And her object was to keep all those kids warm, because there was no heat except 2 fireplaces downstairs. So she probably made hundreds of quilts in her lifetime. Her first quilts were made from worn out clothing and whatnot. I'm sure she was delighted when feed sacks came around. These are 2 of her feed sack quilts. This is a variation on Irish chain. The sashing is dyed feed sack. Absolutely beautiful quilt, although at one point mice got a hold of it, but I wouldn't take anything for it. She also made this one, and again dyed the feed sack. This is a double wedding ring pattern, but all of the prints are feed sack. I'm a quilter myself. I've made over 400 quilts. I have 5 sisters, and they're all quilters, and our children are quilters. I'll show you one here that my sister made, and this is a modern feed sack quilt, a pinwheel. All of the prints are feed sacks. Everything else is purchased material. But there are people still making feed sack quilts today. This one is another one that my grandmother made. It's a simple 9-patch with beautiful yellow sashing, which again, she dyed herself from bleached feed sacks. And if we can move over here to see some more, I can't name the makers of all of these quilts, but I think Catherine can probably help out. This is another feed sack quilt that my grandmother made. And this one, no, I'm wrong. This one is a modern quilt that one of my sisters made using feed sack prints and a purchased blue for the, I think it's called a Indian tomahawk pattern. But we treasure our grandmother's quilts, as many families in Floyd County do. There's so many of them out there. This is another one of my grandmother's. I also would like to show you these now these are pillow tops, pillowcases made on Feedsack. My husband's grandmother made these. The United States Air Force didn't come into existence until the mid-1950s, but she had a son in the Army Air Corps, which was the predecessor of the Air Force. And so she made this one for him, and then another one for another member of the family that was in the Marines with the Marine symbol. So this is an old quilt of my grandmother's, old, very, very worn. This is very dear to me. My grandmother had Feedsack quilts on all the beds in her house. In the summers, 3 of my sisters and I would go and stay at her farm for the summer and help her pick beans and berries and do the canning, and we slept under these sheets. When my own mother became ill in 1996, she told me and my sisters to go to her cedar chest and get Grandma's sheets out. She wanted to sleep under Grandma's sheets. So we did, and she slept under these until she passed. But they're absolutely beautiful, just beautiful. And my sisters and I all have some of these. This is 4 feed sacks sewn together to make a bed sheet. It's double. Bleached many, many times to get the fat hogs out and the chicken. This quilt is one of the treasures that was donated to the gallery. If you'll look at this, these pieces are less than an inch, and they're hand stitched together, and then the entire quilt is hand quilted. Andy Hilton's mother, Nola, made this beauty. And look at the scalloped edge. This is an incredible piece of handwork using the most mundane of materials. When I graduated from high school in 1962, I received 3 sets of pillowcases from my aunts. This one, and this one. And I'm sure there are many others who had these. This is hand crocheted lace trim on a plain white pillowcase. This one is more of a tatted lace, a beautiful handiwork. Now you can see the 4, oops.
Do some cutting and pasting.
The 4 sacks. Oh.
That's great.
Catherine has favorite things. I have favorite things too, besides the quilts. I would like to show you a clothespin apron. My paternal grandmother, Annie Ruth Epperly, made this. It's absolutely beautiful. Sugar sack for the white part, and then feed sack for the coloring, and a beautiful face embroidered on. She also made the apron with the green for me when I was a little girl.
All right, I'm Alice Slusher, and I'm also a longtime volunteer with the gallery. We're an all-volunteer organization. This fabulous quilt is a charm quilt. Every hexagon is a different pattern. And it was a gift to Old Church Gallery by master quilter Jane Shank, who apparently has an excellent collection of feed sacks. Visitors have really enjoyed this one because everyone picks out their own favorite patterns and sees something different every time. And as we were mounting the exhibit last year, it occurred to me that there had to be a duplicate pattern somewhere in all of this marvelous mix of craziness. And so we started searching for it and finally found it with the charm quilt and with this apron, which came from my grandmother. And the apron obviously has been well used. It's stained. It's not what she would have considered a museum piece by any means, but it does have a matching piece in pristine condition in this quilt. And I guess we would have to let you know that the piece is right here. So you can see, and this is one that as we've had younger visitors in, they have been delighted to be the ones to solve the mystery and find the puzzle piece. The pieces in the corner, the bonnet is a very sweet example that is one that would be familiar to so many people in the county. Every grandmother who ever worked a garden in Floyd has made her versions of these. This one probably would have been starched and a little crisper in its day, but from long ago. We have another one over in the corner. Yeah. This one is from Mary Cockram, so the Cockram family, and this one I'm not...
Miss Radford.
Annie Ruth?
Annie Ruth's mother, grandmother.
Okay.
Lula Sweeney Radford.
Lula Sweeney Radford. This one is still starched and very crisp. This one has been laundered, but has not been done that way. And the teddy bear sitting up here is a new piece, but it is made from Feedsacks. Betty Brown at Willis made that and put it in their church bazaar. The material had been saved by a longtime member of their congregation, Miss Virginia Spence. And so after she died, her material was taken up by various members of the church, and they made and sold a number of things to benefit the church out of Feedsack. The sweet little chair is not Feedsack, but it's also part of the collection. It was made by Charlie Hilton, Wilma Reed's grandfather, and it's a donation that comes into our exhibits in many different ways, sometimes for the wood, sometimes for children's things, and sometimes it becomes a shelf for us. While we are over here, one of the most amazing things is that this dress was made by Mildred Nolan, and it has been loaned to us by her husband Marvin Nolan and his daughter Myra Adams. And it is one of the very few women's pieces that we have. So many people have said, well, we always had Feedsacks. I don't know why we didn't keep any of our clothing. But what, beyond just the workmanship with the rickrack trim and the edging, there is a mystery with this one. The side of the dress, the left side, has this finished opening. It's not really big enough to be a pocket. There has been a lot of speculation, but the family members who have seen it, the entire Nolan family came in for a family reunion last summer. No one has any idea why Mrs. Nolan went to all the care and trouble to put this opening into the dress. So if any of the citizens viewers should know, we would love to solve the mystery on that one. The Feedsack material, something we hadn't, I don't think we had mentioned earlier, the cotton for this material was very inexpensive when in the 20s on through the 80s when the last sacks were made. And the prints are not woven in, they are simply printed on, which adds to the inexpensive part. But on some of them, they're almost faded, or they almost appear white on the back. But then on the pretty side, you would never know that they are not. But that was also part of what made them workable. Another example not quite as fancy as the doll clothespin bag, but also equally serviceable was this pink print. You can tell that it has had great use and been out on a clothesline many an hour, but the print is still intact here. That came from the Nolan family. Judy Nolan loaned it to us. This boy's shirt is the only piece of male clothing that we were able to find for the exhibit. And it was loaned by Pam Puckett Frazier, but a very happy little windmill print on it. So the boys were not always doomed to wear girly prints when they were taking advantage of their mothers and grandmothers' sewing. And then this square is a piece that came from a larger piece, and it was made by Margaret Simmons Jessup. She used sugar sacks, and we believe she also unraveled the thread that was used to stitch the sugar into the sack and used it as her embroidery thread. And that was also a frugal but common practice. So the entire piece was grapes, clusters of grapes with the leaves. And after her granddaughter's death, who was my grandmother, the family decided instead of arguing over who had possession of the piece, they would just take the squares apart. So everyone who wanted one got a square to remember her by.
We hope you've enjoyed this little romp through the field of feed sacks with us. We're very pleased that everything that is in the exhibit, as we take it down and return it gently to the people who were kind enough to loan and take part in this exhibit, that everything will be documented and become part of our digital archives, which Tim Smith and Kathleen Inglesby are working on at the present time.